collapsed. And it was such a physically imposing barricade. It was so much uglier and so much more oppressive than people realized from just seeing it on television. When you went to it personally, it was appalling. And Ronald Reagan had gone there.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
John Kennedy had gone there.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
So even with all the turmoil that was going on, it seemed unlikely that that wall, which was at once such a solid image of oppression, would come down in some fashion. And then in a heartbeat, it did.
I was the only journalist on the air the night the Berlin Wall came down. I owned that story, and that was the end of the Soviet Empire. And we got lucky.
I'd like to tell you that I knew the wall was coming down. Unfortunately, I cannot. I didn't know. But it did come down on my watch, and I will never forget it.
East Germany remains a country in turmoil tonight.
Now, I arrived in Berlin 2 days before the wall came down because there was so much going on in the eastern sector. I was able to get into the east for the first time and do some reporting from there.
You all represent the best of East Germany.
And then late that afternoon, there was that famous news conference in which Gunter Schabowski, who was the propaganda chief, screwed up.
He was handed a slip of paper at the very end and said, Politburo has decided that all citizens of the GDR can leave the GDR and come back through at any of the transit points.
And I looked at my German national cameraman and sound man, and I said, did he say what we thought he said? They were astonished. They said, he did. That means you can go out of the wall and come back anywhere you want to. The room was abuzz. This man gets up and leaves the room.
I had an interview arranged with him right after that news conference, and I went up and I read it back to him.
Mr. Schabowski, do I understand correctly? Citizens of the GDR can leave through any checkpoint that they choose for personal reasons.
It is possible for them to go through the border.
Freedom to travel.
Yes, of course.
And I went downstairs and some of my print colleagues were there, and I said, it's open. I mean, the wall is open.
So we got out, called the office in New York, and this was midday back in the States. We started making preparations for going on the air that night. There were lots of students from the West who come to the top of the wall, and the East German guards were trying to hose them off. And then my heart sank, thinking, oh my God, there's not going to be anybody there. I made this big deal about the wall coming down, and they've all been cleared off. Then the people got back up on the wall, and by the time we came on the air at 6:30, it was chaos.
Stand by. A historic moment tonight. The Berlin Wall can no longer contain the East German people.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight from West Berlin.
Good evening, Mark.
We had a path on the satellite to get on the air, so that night I came on the air. And we owned the story. No CBS, no ABC.
It was a worldwide exclusive.
What you're watching live on television is a historic moment, a moment that will live forever. You're seeing the destruction of the Berlin Wall.
We just threw out the script. I mean, I'd written this whole broadcast.
And I said to our producer, stay with me, I'm gonna have to outlive everything here. I'm just gonna have to call on all my experience about what's been going on in the eastern part of, not just Germany, but in the Soviet Union, and how this is the defining moment.
Now, for the first time since the wall was erected in 1961.
So I went on the air that night without the satellite. I just did a pre-recorded thing and said, I don't know where this goes tomorrow, but we should stick around. So the next day I did something very much like that. And I had arranged an interview with Gunter Schabowski, the man that you saw who made the announcement. He was the propaganda chief for the East. And we went to the news conference that you saw there briefly, and it was at the end of a long day, and it was hot in the room, and everybody was kind of dozing off. And he was giving us a short shrift on everything that we asked him, until somebody handed him that piece of paper. It turns out he got it wrong. You know, the Politburo did not want him to announce he could go out. The idea was that they were going to make an arrangement so they could go out, but they'd have to come back in some fashion. But he read it, and there it went, and it went out over East German television as well. So everybody in this sector knew what was happening. When we got back to Checkpoint Charlie, racing to the office, I said to the surly guard, have you heard the announcement? And I said, what do you think? Not paid to think. And he said, you can go on. He didn't give us any grief at all. So we called and made the arrangements for getting the satellite activated. And we knew that this was a transformational moment in Germany, but we didn't know how much. As journalists, we were able to get that onto the air. And we got the satellite out there. And when I first got to Brandenburg, there were a few students from the West who had climbed up on top of the wall, and they were immediately hosed off by the East German guards who didn't quite know what to do, except one man. He stood with his back to the East German guards. He had a leather jacket on, and I could still see him, and he was being applauded by everybody. And I said to one of my colleagues, go get him. He's a symbol of the new Germany, and we'll put him on the air, and he'll be on the cover of Time magazine next week. My friend came back, and he said, not what we think. And I said, what do you mean? He said, he's a drunk. He's been living over here in the forest, and this is the first shower he's had in 2 weeks. He missed his opportunity to be a historic figure. And then we had somebody at the Braunhammer Bridge, one of our cameramen, and we had not yet seen anybody coming from the east into the west as I was getting ready to go on the air. And 5 minutes beforehand, one of our cameramen he'd run all that way with a cassette and said, we've got it. We've got him going across the bridge. And so when you see me coming on the air, first night, this historic night, and right before we went on, I said to our producer, Cheryl Gould, back in New York, there's no script. I'm just going to have to wing my way through this whole half hour. Just stay with me, which is my famous phrase when things are going crazy, stay with me. And we did it successfully, and everybody gets credit for it. The cameramen, the technicians, the people who were arranging the satellite. It wasn't just about me. It was the best time that everybody came together to capture what we knew would be a story that would live forever. Now I'll give you one quick personal angle on it as well. It got a lot of play in the United States, obviously. People were staying up to watch it and everything. We were having some work done in our apartment, so we moved into a temporary place across Central Park, and my wife had gone to the theater that night. Came home, and without turning on the television set, walked the dogs, came back, went to sleep, got up the next morning, walked the dogs to the park. Still no idea what I'd been through or what was going on. And people were coming up to her sobbing, saying, you must be so proud of him. And she was saying, oh yes, of course. She had no idea what they were talking about. And then she ran home and turned on the television set and realized what I had been through. So it's always been for me a kind of emblematic of our relationship. I do what I do, she does what she does, and we go on from there. There was not a moment of acute danger. We didn't know what those guards were going to do if they weren't successful. And later in reporting done by others who come back, the guards were as befuddled as everybody else. They couldn't get, it turns out the whole Politburo had gone home and gone to bed in the compound. They didn't know what to do. So the guards were left with this enormous decision. And at the bridge, which was a critical point, the guard was tempted to shoot. And he acknowledged that. But then he thought, can't do that. I mean, they were well trained, like the German standards, but he let them go. So I didn't feel endangered at all. And in fact, the freedom that we had the day before in East Germany was really quite remarkable. I didn't have anybody following me around. I could go where I wanted to, talk to dissidents. And so the transition was underway, but we thought it would all be at a much different pace than it turned out to be. I was on the air yesterday, back to New York, or back to Washington, with James Baker, who was the Secretary of State at the time. They didn't have a clue. I mean, there was no intel that was saying this could happen, for good reason, because no one thought it was going to happen in the East or in the West. And he was at a lunch, and then he got the word the wall is coming down, and he made a toast, and I can't remember now who he was entertaining, but he went back to the White House, and they made a big decision, the President and George Bush, President Bush, 41, and Jim, that they didn't want to poke a finger in the eye of the Russians, so to speak. They wanted to play it very cool because they didn't want to make it more difficult for Gorbachev than they already knew that it would be. Gorbachev had hardliners, as you know, later he was arrested by them, who were unhappy about it. And there were a lot of people who thought maybe, including me, I think, at the time, that maybe it would have been an opportunity for a statement about this is a new era, we can all work together and so on. But on reflection, I think that they did make the right call. Just figure out where we're going and how we're going to get there at this point. I mean, of all the things that I've done in my career, there was nothing that was quite as spontaneous as that one. I'll tell you, one of the better moments is when I got up the next morning and watched Dan Rather and Peter Jennings walking into the second day of the story. That was in our we were all got along extremely well. We were all generationally about the same. We covered stories around the world, very competitive. But in our business, we call that a clean kill, and they knew that I had a clean kill at that point. They each had one as well along the way. But I stayed for several days. I can't remember exactly how many to do the stories about the fabric of life and how it would change. It was, I later would say to audiences, standing at the gates, watching people coming from the moon to Mars, frankly. You know, they were coming with their little Ladas and their acid-stained jeans and their cheap clothing and their prams. And then they would come into Berlin, and there would be beautiful boulevards, sleek automobiles, and department stores filled with everything you could possibly want. And they had just, 24 hours earlier had been a lifetime away from seeing any of that. So there have been very few times, I think, in history in which one people with common origin have been so divided, and then it changed overnight. And that too is something that was really striking to me. I met a man who had, on the western side, would get up in the morning and he could look across the wall and see a man who I think was a tailor. And they would wave to each other. They never communicated with each other until the wall came down for all those years. So there were great, great human stories that were going on. And Angela Merkel walked across the wall that night. Think about that. She'd been a laboratory technician in the East. And then she came to be the most powerful chancellor in Central Europe later. So it was a time of great transition, which is part of the appeal of being a journalist, frankly. That you can see history as it unfolds and then try to think in advance about the consequences of it. I really did think it was the beginning of a new era and that the transition could not be reversed at that point. I'd also done the first interview with Gorbachev a year and a half earlier. So I knew what his intentions were. He was also trapped a little bit by his own intellectual upbringing. He thought that he could preserve a form of socialism and communism, but he lost his inner core at that point. The people had helped him get to where he was. And so I knew that there was a big struggle going on in Moscow about what they would do, and that would have a direct application, obviously, to the East, which was kind of a hostile, if you will, island in the Soviet Empire. And the people who were running the East at that point were second rate. They'd been people who'd been down in the bureaucracy, and suddenly they were up running the country, and they really didn't know what to do. And I was able to have most of the conversation that day was the guy who made the announcement, and then I came back a year later and talked to him, and he said by then he was bereft. He'd lost his pension. His mother had lost his pension, and he realized what a dolt he'd been. But he said we were operating at a day-to-day, moment-to-moment. I think we're not at a dangerous time because the possibility of nuclear exchange between the two great powers was still in existence. What we saw with Gorbachev was an attempt to change that, to detente, relaxing the tension. He was trying to do that. And he had such an engaging, personal way that when he came to America, for example, people didn't treat him as a bogeyman of some kind. They could see where, as Margaret Thatcher once said, we can do business with this man. So there was a transition that was going on there. I think what's going on now, not just in Germany and Central Europe, but in the West generally, is that there is a whole new, as I need not tell you, is a whole new dangerous transition, and that is the refugee issue. The chaos in the Middle East pouring into Europe, and the resistance in many of these European countries, often with very good reason, about what their place is going to be. And that's going on in our country as well, about what's happening with the South Americans who are coming across the border, not just from Mexico, but from a number of other places. And I've been trying trying to put this in some kind of historic context, I don't think the West, especially, has ever been through that kind of chaotic transition. You know, we had, my family came as Irishmen from Ireland in the potato famine, where the Brokaw name is a Huguenot name, and they came very early to America in the 1600s. But then from the mid-1800s on, that was a very successful transition of people escaping, you know, poor economic conditions, coming to America, opening the West, doing that kind of thing. Now it's desperate people, different cultures, different attitudes about how life should be lived, pouring into the most established part of the world there is, frankly, from a civilization point of view. That's a tricky part, and I don't see the solution to that. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, beginning with Beirut and the Israeli wars, but then transitioning into Iraq and Afghanistan. And it remains a deep, unsettling mystery about how we get this resolved. Because the population continues to grow, the religions are at war with each other, and also with the rest of the world, especially the Western world, and our values. And I'm not sure that we have the kind of leadership that we had during this time, when East Germany was formed, the strong resistance that was put on by the West, by West Germany, by England, by the United States, about how we hold the Soviet Union in check. I don't know how you plug all the holes now. That's the tricky part for me. And they're desperate people. And those who get here, frankly, in our country, do quite well. They assimilate. And there's a desperate need for a lot of them in the jobs that are available. I was really struck by something yesterday that I had an experience that was interesting to me. We have a wonderful driver working for NBC who's Ethiopian. And I had to go to a pharmacy to buy some pharmaceutical goods. And he knew the clerk. And he said to me, our driver did, he's also Ethiopian, but we're from warring tribes. He was from the south, I'm from the north. Our people were at war with each other constantly. But they were able to come to Germany and start new lives. And these two people from these great rivals were now friends and productively involved in the future of Germany. And so we are at a historic transition, not just in the West, but in other parts of the world as well. The wall that is being put up by Donald Trump as best as he thinks that he can is nothing as ominous and as unacceptable as it is in a lot of ways. It's not nearly as ominous as what was going on here. People who are trying to come in the United States are not going to be shot, on sight, and they're not going to leave behind enormous families. But that's a perfect extension of just what I was talking about. You have all this poverty and unsettled political conditions in so much of the world, in the second and third countries. And where does the population go? My own experience has been, I'll share this with you for a moment, is that we were living in California when Central America first began to blow up. And Meredith was at home with 3 small children and needed some help. And a church said, we have a wonderful woman here who's from Salvador, and maybe she can help. So she came, and she became a member of our family. And we began to learn more and more about her. She was very close. She was nervous about it. She came from the highlands in Salvador. And the reason she came to America is that the junta in Salvador was after her sons and her husband to force them into the military or to exterminate them. And so she was trying to get money to help them out. It was beginning for us of an odyssey that I would never ever regret, nor do we protected illegals. We took her, we had her daughter. She said, my daughter Ceci would like to come. We think she can get across the border on a holiday, religious holiday. 2 in the morning, there's a knock on our door. Ceci was not 17 as her mother told she was 12. She came all the way from Salvador and was there in our house. So we moved to Washington, and we had a 3rd floor, and we ran a safe house. And I have no apologies about that whatsoever. They're all citizens now. They're all productive members of the society in Washington and what they do. Leonora has gone back to Salvador and has found a she's a member of our family, frankly, and her values were phenomenal. She was a very religious woman, cared deeply about her family, made enormous sacrifices. Those are the stories that most people in this country need to hear, frankly. We're richer for it in a lot of ways. I'm in a little bit of, no, I'm not going to call it a dispute, but I made a comment on the air recently in which I said that I think the Hispanics have to work harder at assimilation. And a Florida columnist wrote a savage column about me, called me an idiot and said I should be fired for saying that. He lives in Florida. I go out to Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. All the food processing plants wouldn't exist now without the people that we're having come from Central and South America. But they confine themselves to their own culture. And it would be better for them, and that's what I was saying, if they would kind of work harder at assimilation and not just at language. They're teaching, the kids are all learning to speak English, but they really are, I think, still adjusting to where they are, and a lot of them want to go back. But this guy thought this is a chance for me to knock off a big anchor man, wrote a savage tone about what an idiot I was, and I should have been fired. And he'd met me one time, and all I wanted to talk about was living in Montana, so how would I know about Hispanics? When I lived in Southern California, and I was there with, at the beginning of the farm workers movement, covered that a lot, right? So one of the things that happens when you get to the visibility that you have in the job that I have is that I don't feel they can take you on, but there's so much ignorance about where we are in this country in terms of what's happening in New York. I walked down the street and I thought, almost every day, I thought, if I blew a whistle and said I'm ICE, everybody on the street would scatter because 90% of them are illegal. You know, they're doing the trash, they're delivering everything in the middle of the night, riding their bikes, and they're keeping the damn city going, frankly, from a not just from an economic point of view, but there's a culture that they're doing as well. So we haven't come to a very good conclusion about what we're going to do about all this.
I'm Lane Lucky from KLTV in Tyler, Texas. So millions of Americans watched your coverage of the Berlin Wall coming down. They experienced that through television. For this latest generation that either wasn't alive or too young to remember, what do you think, from your perspective and your experiences, is the most important thing about the peaceful revolution that they should understand or know about?
Well, I'm thinking about this a lot. There's a big war going on I've been reading about between the new generation and what they call the boomers, the people that they're working for, as you're well aware. Maureen Dowd was telling me about an assistant that she has who says, hey, boomer, you know, when she comes to some conclusion about something, because there's a whole new attitude, philosophy, value kind of cohort, if you will, and the younger people coming alive. So I think there needs to be more dialogue between the generations about what we went through, my generation, what the next generation went through, what the baby boomers learned when they went off the rails and went way hard left and went anti-establishment, and the country was teetering at that point. And they learned that for their family and for their country and for their own future, there are certain structures that have to be followed. So the best way to do it is that we all work together to find out what they are. We can all learn from each other. And I think that, for me, is the big, big challenge now for future generations. There are, say this as well, but we are a stronger country because of the experience of a lot of people in the longest wars in our history, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Veterans who are coming back, men and women, are coming back extremely well trained. They have a discipline about them. They have seen the dangers in the far-off worlds. They're going to college and they're lifting every campus where they appear. And by doing that, they also lift all the students with whom they're going to school. And we ought to be able to capitalize on them some. Now, a number of them are running for office. And I think that's a good thing because they've seen the dangers of what it's like out there. The military, for whatever else we think about it, has a lot of great values. It's the best integrated part of American society. When you show up, they don't ask you, where you're from. They want to know what you can do and whether you can do the job and get along with everybody else, and that's critically important. I brought back, actually, we had a computer technician that was there off to the side, and he took it upon his assignment to fill a little sack for me with chunks of the wall, and I had them encased and gave them to my mother-in-law and my mother, you know, with the date and the time, and I keep a piece on my desk as well, and I've got other bigger chunks as well, although my wife is tired of carrying those around. But you know, this business, the other collection that I have are from Normandy Beach. And I always pick up a couple when I'm there and I date it. You know, this is Omaha Beach and this date and that kind of thing, just as reminders. I'm not very good at keeping a diary. I'm very good. I have an exceptional memory for small details. So I can write it down later and be pretty much right on it, and I try to keep that going. But mostly I look back as a kid who grew up in working class South Dakota and think, how the hell did this happen? You know, I had all these chances and opportunities. Well, I can't say that I was had such great vision that I could see things exactly as they happened. I always believed that the clash between the East and the West, between Moscow and the West, would not come to a good end. You know, there were times because of my age when we had the possibility of a nuclear holocaust with the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. I lived in Omaha. We had SAC headquarters. You know, they were up there in the air every day doing things, and that was part of the coverage that we had in South Dakota. We had missile silos all across the state. We used to say to each other, "Oh, we're okay, we're in South Dakota," and then we realized that we were a primary target because out in the western part of the state were all these missile silos. And there was a kind of conditioning that took in, oh, God, I don't think that can happen. I think what worries me most now is the cultural and ethnic tension between nations about not wanting to give up their identity, and others desperate to find some secure place to live out their lives with their children. And it's not just in the Middle East, it's also in Africa. As you know, if you go through Africa, the continent of all extraordinary natural resources and really enterprising people, but it's not moved much, frankly. My wife has a program in southeastern Africa where she went one time to work on an AIDS project. She met all these women. It's Malawi, and all these women are in the streets selling tomatoes off tabletops. And she's kind of way ahead of Martha Stewart, frankly, when it comes to doing that kind of thing. She wanted to say, so how do you preserve them? And they said, what do you mean preserve them? She said, I mean, you know, when the season runs out, how do you have one? They had no way of doing it. They had no idea what she was talking about. She couldn't find a mason jar in all of southern Africa. She came back to New York, talked to the glass companies, took 4 of her friends, trained them how to can tomatoes in her kitchen. And then another very, very wealthy friend of hers who was so inspired by this said, I can get the family plane and we'll go back and we'll set up businesses. So this is 15 years ago now. They now have a thriving business in Malawi of these women who have been put together, and they all kind of found their roles. You know, one's in marketing, one runs the kitchen, one runs the fields. And they're more than breaking even, and they're also feeding AIDS orphans 4 times a week who live in that same village as they do. And they have enormous pride in what they're doing and how it's working about. But it's really been tough. It's a struggle. First time I went with her, I went on this road. It was not even a 2-lane road to get up to the place that we're driving late at night with a driver going 135 clicks. And I said to her, got there, I said, well, I do this stuff all over the world. This is nuts. Don't do this ever again. You gotta drive daytime and you gotta get a better driver. And I don't want you, you can't do this. She said, well, it's the only way to get here. She's very adventurous. So, but it's been a really rewarding experience for our family. And she'll have a fundraiser once a year, and Upper East Siders will come and write big checks, and so they're keeping it going. It's very well managed, but that's just one example. In one village in one northern part of Malawi where things are beginning to work. Think about all the effort it took to get to there. And that's what really kind of depresses me. We're going to describe what's going on here now, but yesterday we were at Stasi, and looking at the files. They have 4 miles of files, 4 miles of files on every citizen in East Germany. Big, thick files. And when you come back now and look at what's going on there, what was going on there, you think it was incomprehensible. They weren't doing anything that was productive. They were just keeping track of each other. So we're going to do that. And also, the other thing that this is part of the, not just the Today Show, but the longer coverage. As you have probably been hearing since you've been here, there's still a real division between East and West. A lot of the people who stayed in the East resent that they haven't shared in the progress, and they're older, and so they were raised in the kind of Eastern philosophy, the East German philosophy, about what was expected of them as citizens. That's a coming issue for them. And the issue that is also coming to not just Germany, but to Central Europe, is whether they can be an alliance again, whether they can, join arms and be NATO again, or do they just revert to their own, understandably, narrow self-interest. And then we're going to talk, obviously, about how this all happened for us. But I'm still at work in my own head about how I want to explain what's going on to the country, because we don't pay as much attention anymore, to Europe, frankly. We're paying much more attention to what's going on the border, much more attention to what's going on in Asia than we have to this. I'm kind of heartbroken, but I also understand the competitive realities and the economic realities. By the time Lester comes on the air at 6:30, people have been inundated with news all day long, and they have access to news, not just in the morning newspaper, but they're looking at their iPhone all day long. And so how do you hold the audience and make it economically feasible to keep nightly news going? I'm an old dude, so my argument is to them, be unique, remind them that it's a wider world than what they're seeing, and don't be just an extension of what they've been seeing all day long everywhere else. I mean, there are lots of different examples of that, I think. I mean, this stuff that's going on in Hong Kong is going to lead to a big explosion in China. It's just, you can just see it coming. And and all you have to do is show on the air. This is the 30th day in a row that the Hong Kong residents have been in the streets. The Chinese have not figured out it. We're going to be watching this story because at some point it's likely to blow up, and we should be paying attention to it. That kind of story. The other kind of story is that it's a little tougher. It's better for print. There is a coming clash between new media and the political system. They're not going to let Google get away with what it's getting away for as long as they have been. They're not going to let Facebook get away with it as long as they have been, because they become so powerful and so invasive in a lot of ways. They're geniuses, and we all appreciate what they're doing. But the fact is, at some point, just like in the early 20th century or late 19th century, they had to break up companies because they became larger than the nation in which they existed. I actually was there at the beginning of the whole business of going online and everything. I met Bill Gates before he was very well known, and I went out deliberately to see him. And I said, I can see you're going to want to get in our business. Communication can be a big part of what you're going to do, so we can get into this establishment. And then I started a series on MSNBC called Silicon Valley Summits, in which we could get, because they all were trying to sell their product, we could get Bill, we could get Jeff, we could get everybody that we wanted to. And I remember when Jeff Bezos stock was selling at $110 a share, they were not making a dime. And he was at a panel with me at Stanford, and I was going around introducing people. And I said, by the way, Mr. Bezos, can you even spell profit? He said, yes, Mr. Brokaw, P-R-O-P-H-E-T. I'm a prophet. I thought it was the best damn answer imaginable. And we've stayed in touch since then. On the other hand, we have so little control over that, and Facebook especially, about who's putting that stuff online, and how much of our privacy is being penetrated by them. What they know about us that we don't know that they know about us. Those are all things that concern me. I can't say that I have much of an answer, but I think we need to have more of a national dialogue about it, quite honestly. The judgment I make about what we broadcast on values and impact. You know, is this something that is just interesting, or does it have a real effect on society? Or is it moving the needle in some fashion politically? But getting back to what I was talking about a moment ago, with social media, we don't have control over that. You know, people can go online and just say anything that they want to and make up stuff. And then we're expected to react to it. We lived in Montana a fair amount of our lives in the summertime. We had this wonderful woman that worked for us, and she would come across the bridge every morning at where we got our ranch. And a very bright, very dedicated woman. Her eyes would be big. She said, "You can't believe what I read on the internet this morning." And I would always say the same thing. "You're right, I can't believe what I read on the internet this morning." She said, "Oh yeah, you always tell me that." 2 days later, "Tom, you're not going to believe what I read on the internet this morning." And we don't have a way of controlling that. I don't have control of this. You know, somebody pushes that button in the morning and it goes out there, and there's no retrieving it. You can't get it back, and it stays there. You know, however, I don't quite know how to describe this. However, not well established a site may be. You know, it's been made up in the last 24 hours. But then they get a little piece of information, they throw it up, and it stays there. And they don't have to, if they're not NBC or CBS or New York Times or whatever. You know, our era is threatened, quite honestly, by all of this. And I understand, I really believe that Vox Pop is important, that people ought to have a voice. But with that voice comes responsibility. And it really becomes part of the culture, and we ought to have more of a dialogue about it. But the dialogue that we now have is frankly militant and mean. If you don't fall in line, then you know they kill you. I tweet from time to time. I do a lot of stuff that are important to me, and I sometimes do a little experiment. I go a little bit offline on something that I know that people have strong feelings about. I get killed immediately. You know, I always thought you were a good guy. I can't believe that you're a threat to our country, and all that kind of stuff. Because everybody feels empowered by the voice that they now have, that